My name is Natalie, and at 33 years old, my own mother tried to declare me legally insane just days before my business trip to Switzerland. She called a mandatory family meeting, sitting me down in her lavish Chicago living room. She slid a thick folder across her custom marble coffee table, flanked by my sister and her husband demanding complete control of my assets for my own good. I did not scream or cry or beg for understanding. I simply smiled, signed a single piece of paper, and walked out the door to catch my flight. By the time they logged into my accounts, my entire net worth had completely vanished into thin air. Before I reveal exactly how I pulled off the ultimate financial ghost protocol, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve exactly what is coming to them. The ambush began on a rainy Thursday evening. My mother, Patricia, sat perfectly poised on her white leather sofa, wearing her usual expression of calculated disappointment. She pushed a heavy legal document toward me. The bold letters at the top read, "Full financial power of attorney. Your career as a forensic accountant is destroying your mind, Natalie," Patricia said, her voice dripping with artificial maternal concern. "The stress is clearly causing a mental breakdown. We need to restructure everything to protect you from yourself." I stared at the document, refusing to let the familiar sting of betrayal show on my face. Before I could respond, my brother-in-law Jamal stepped forward from the shadows of the room. Jamal was an African-American wealth manager who ran a boutique investment firm downtown. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, flashing the brilliant, charming smile that had successfully manipulated half the city into trusting him with their money. "Listen to your mother," Natalie, Jamal said, using his smooth corporate tone. "The market is incredibly volatile right now. Your portfolio is bleeding value, and you are not in the right headspace to make rational decisions. My firm needs immediate access to stabilize your assets and protect your future. Let family take care of this burden for you." The sheer audacity of his request hung heavily in the air. Jamal was not asking to help me. He was demanding the keys to the empire I had built entirely on my own. My younger sister Audrey chimed in right on cue. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together. "You should be grateful we are stepping in to help," Audrey scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You are 33, single, and completely childless. You have absolutely no idea how to build generational wealth or manage real money. Jamal knows exactly what he is doing. You should stop being so stubborn and just hand over the accounts." I did not immediately respond to Audrey. Instead, I picked up the thick legal folder and flipped past the first few pages. Tucked neatly near the back was a comprehensive psychological evaluation. I scanned the rigid clinical language detailing my supposed severe anxiety, erratic behavior, and inability to handle personal finances. Then my eyes landed on the signature at the bottom of the final page. Dr. Gregory Vance. The air in my lungs turned to ice, but my face remained an unreadable mask. I knew that signature perfectly. It belonged to the exact same private psychiatrist my parents had bribed 15 years ago. Back then, I was a straight-A high school student planning my escape to a top-tier university. But Audrey had just wrecked her car and demanded a brand-new luxury convertible. Instead of saying no to their golden child, my parents paid Dr. Vance to diagnose me as emotionally unstable and prone to reckless behavior. They used that fake medical record to legally drain my entire college savings account, claiming the funds needed to be redirected for my supposed mental health treatments. In reality, they took every single dime I had earned from part-time jobs and academic scholarships to buy Audrey her sports car. They had crippled my future once using this exact same playbook, forcing me to take out massive student loans and work night shifts just to survive. Now, seeing my success as a forensic accountant, they were dusting off their favorite weapon to try and steal everything I had built as an adult. My father, Richard, finally spoke from his armchair by the fireplace. He pointed a stern finger at me. "Do not make this difficult, Natalie. We already have the medical documentation. If you refuse to sign that power of attorney tonight, your mother and I will go to the state tomorrow morning. We will have you declared legally incompetent and take control of the estate anyway." Do the smart thing and hand the portfolio over to Jamal voluntarily. They sat there, a united front of greed and entitlement, fully expecting the frightened, compliant girl from 15 years ago to surrender. They expected tears. They expected a desperate defense of my sanity. They expected me to beg for their approval. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a fountain pen. I flipped the heavy document back to the front page. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Patricia smiled triumphantly, assuming she had won. "We just want what is best for the family, dear." I ignored the actual power of attorney's signature line. Instead, I grabbed a blank piece of paper from my purse, quickly scribbled my name on it to acknowledge I had received their ridiculous paperwork, and slid the folder back across the marble table toward my mother. "I am not signing over my estate," I said, standing up and smoothing out my skirt. "But you are welcome to manage whatever funds you can actually find, Jamal. Good luck." I stepped out the door to catch my flight. Inside, Jamal eagerly flipped open his laptop, completely unaware. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, severing the last physical tie between Natalie and her family. The instant the lock engaged, the stifling atmosphere of artificial maternal concern evaporated from the lavish Chicago living room. Patricia immediately dropped her worried expression, her face relaxing into a tight, satisfied smile. She walked over to the custom mahogany bar and poured herself a generous glass of vintage Merlot, her diamond rings clinking against the crystal. Jamal cracked his knuckles, a gesture of pure corporate arrogance, and took a seat at the marble coffee table. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, shooting a victorious smirk toward his wife Audrey. Richard, standing by the limestone fireplace, let out a loud sigh of relief. He praised Jamal for his persuasive tact, loudly proclaiming that this was the financial injection the family had been waiting for. Audrey did not even look up from her smartphone. She was already browsing luxury real estate listings in the Hamptons, casually mentioning that Natalie would never need an $18 million estate, since she was destined to die alone in her downtown penthouse. Audrey reminded her parents that they deserved this money for putting up with Natalie's difficult personality all these years. Richard agreed, laughing as he recalled how much easier this was compared to the time they had to intercept Natalie's college scholarship checks to keep his failing hardware business afloat. They spoke about Natalie's hard-earned wealth as if it were a communal family lottery winnings ripe for the taking. Marcus. The family's corrupt lawyer wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He pulled an encrypted flash drive from his leather briefcase and plugged it into his laptop. He opened the secure banking portal, fully prepared to execute the fraudulent power of attorney. Jamal leaned over Marcus's shoulder, his eyes wide with hungry anticipation. Jamal instructed Marcus to drain the primary checking account first, directing the funds straight into his own boutique wealth management holding account to cover what he vaguely referred to as immediate market fluctuations. Marcus typed in the routing numbers Natalie had left behind. He pressed the enter key. The loading icon spun on the screen, reflecting in Jamal's eager eyes. The page refreshed. The primary checking account loaded. The balance displayed was $0.00. Jamal let out a short, dismissive laugh. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder, telling the lawyer he must have entered a typo. Jamal stated that the banking servers were probably just glitching from the heavy, encrypted traffic. Marcus cleared his throat, his fingers trembling slightly as he deleted the numbers and carefully re-entered the checking routing information. He hit enter again. The result was identical, zero balance. Patricia stopped sipping her wine. She lowered her glass, her sharp eyes darting toward the laptop. She demanded to know what was causing the delay, reminding Jamal that they needed to transfer the funds before Natalie's flight landed in Switzerland, and she realized what they had done. Jamal shoved Marcus aside, aggressively taking control of the keyboard. He sneered, calling the lawyer incompetent. Jamal pulled up the documentation for Natalie's high-yield savings account. He manually punched in the account sequence, his fingers flying across the keys with desperate speed. He slammed the enter key. The screen flashed white, then loaded the requested financial data. $0. The silence in the living room became absolute. The rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock suddenly sounded like a countdown. Richard pushed himself away from the fireplace, his face darkening with anger. He marched over to the coffee table and stood behind Jamal, demanding an explanation. Audrey finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in annoyance, asking why Jamal was playing games with their money. Jamal was no longer smiling. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. He ignored Richard and Audrey, his breathing growing shallow and fast. He navigated to the main dashboard of the banking portal and input the master routing number for Natalie's entire corporate investment portfolio. This was the crown jewel, the massive accumulation of assets she had built over a decade of relentless corporate forensic accounting. Jamal hit the execute button. The page took a few seconds longer to load. When it finally rendered, there was no list of stocks, there were no bond yields, there was no cash value. Instead, a stark, bright red security banner stretched across the top of the monitor. Jamal began to panic. He hit the refresh button. The red banner remained. He hit it again. He started slamming the F5 key repeatedly, the plastic clattering violently under his aggressive strikes. He cursed under his breath, his corporate charm completely shattered by raw, primal panic. Patricia lost her temper. She slammed her wine glass down on the bar, the red liquid splashing over the rim. She screamed at Marcus to get on the phone with the regional bank manager immediately. She yelled that the bank's system was broken and threatened to sue them for obstructing her legal rights. She reminded everyone that she had already signed preliminary contracts for a luxury yacht renovation, fully depending on Natalie's cash to clear by the morning. Marcus did not reach for his phone. He slowly placed his hands on the edge of the laptop and turned the screen around to face Patricia and Richard. He did not speak. He just pointed a shaking finger at the bold white text blaring from inside the red security banner. Patricia leaned in her eyes, squinting to read the glowing words. The notification was blunt and legally binding. It stated that all liquid assets, investment portfolios, and linked holdings associated with Natalie's identity had been permanently transferred out of the jurisdiction. The funds were locked inside a sovereign, irrevocable blind trust. The accounts displayed on the screen were nothing more than digital ghost shells left active but entirely empty. Richard grabbed the laptop, lifting it off the table and shouting that this was impossible. He screamed that Natalie could not have known their plan, that she was too busy and too naive to orchestrate a defensive financial maneuver of this magnitude. He demanded Marcus find a loophole to break the blind trust. Marcus quietly informed him that breaking a sovereign blind trust would take years of federal litigation and millions of dollars in legal fees, money they absolutely did not have. The reality of the situation crashed down on the room with crushing weight. Patricia realized the $18 million she planned to steal was gone forever. The massive safety net she intended to use to cover Jamal's mysterious business debts and secure her own extravagant lifestyle had vanished right from under her nose. The financial dominance she thought she held over her daughter was a complete illusion. Patricia's face turned ash white. She clutched her chest, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of her blouse. She let out a ragged, choking gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her knees buckled and she collapsed in a heap, hitting the floor and sliding onto the expensive Persian rug. Audrey dropped her smartphone. She screamed in terror, dropping to her knees beside her mother. Audrey grabbed Jamal's arm, violently shaking him, begging him to pull out his phone and call an ambulance immediately. But Jamal did not move to help his mother-in-law. He did not reach for his phone to dial emergency services. He stood frozen over the coffee table, completely ignoring the chaotic medical emergency unfolding at his feet. Jamal was staring down at his own smartphone resting on the marble surface. A new email notification had just popped up on his screen from Natalie. He stared at the subject line in absolute terror, his jaw unhinged, as the horrifying reality of his own impending destruction finally dawned on him. 72 hours before my flight to Zurich, my home office was pitch black except for the glow of my dual monitors. The rain lashed heavily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Chicago penthouse, casting fractured shadows across my desk. My office setup was built for exactly this kind of digital warfare. 3 custom-built towers hummed beneath my desk, processing massive amounts of data. I was in the middle of reviewing a routine corporate audit when a harsh, blaring alarm shattered the quiet. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson. It was a proprietary security protocol I had coded myself designed specifically to monitor the routing numbers of my core offshore and domestic portfolios. Someone was trying to establish a persistent backdoor connection to my primary checking account. The intruder was relentless, throwing thousands of password combinations at my server every second in an aggressive brute force script to bypass the two-factor authentication I had set up with my private banking concierge. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my training immediately took over. I am a forensic accountant. I hunt digital ghosts and financial predators for a living. I pushed away the panic and let the cold, calculating part of my brain take the wheel. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I locked down the external gateways, secured the firewall, and initiated a reverse trace. I expected the digital breadcrumbs to lead to a server farm in Eastern Europe or a compromised proxy network in South America. Instead, the data packets bounced through a local commercial hub, the trace resolved with terrifying speed. I watched the packet data route through the local servers, confirming the exact physical location of the attacker. The IP address was static. It was registered to a commercial lease on the 45th floor of a premium skyscraper on LaSalle Street. It was the exact floor suite and registered network of Jamal's boutique wealth management firm. He was likely sitting at his mahogany desk, sweating through his silk shirt, waiting for the script to crack my vault. My own brother-in-law was actively trying to hack into my bank accounts in the middle of the night. The betrayal tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat. Jamal was supposed to be the corporate golden boy, the charismatic savior who married my sister and elevated our family's social standing. He wore imported tailored suits, drove a leased Aston Martin, and hosted high-profile charity galas. Yet here he was deploying illegal scraping software to breach my personal firewall. I did not call the police. I did not call my parents to complain. I went straight on the offensive. If Jamal was reckless enough to attack my network, his own digital footprint would be sloppy. I bypassed his firm's rudimentary firewall in less than 4 minutes. I sliced through the client privacy shields and dropped straight into the master financial ledgers of his firm. What I found waiting for me in the dark corners of his server was a complete financial bloodbath. I pulled up the client intake files. My parents' names sat at the very top of his priority investor list. I opened their portfolio and felt my stomach drop into my shoes. Patricia and Richard had completely liquidated their retirement accounts. Worse, public property records cross-referenced in Jamal's database showed a massive newly finalized lien. They had mortgaged their pristine, fully paid-off estate in the suburbs. Every single dollar of equity, every ounce of their life savings had been wired directly into Jamal's flagship hedge fund. My parents had handed him everything they owned. Staring at the digital transfer receipts, a bitter, vicious memory clawed its way to the surface of my mind. I was 18 years old, standing in the sterile lobby of our local bank. My father was at the teller window, casually withdrawing every single dollar I had saved from 3 years of tutoring and working retail. I had begged him to stop, telling him with tears in my eyes that the money was my college tuition. He just looked at me with cold indifference, handed a thick cashier's check to Audrey, and told her to go pick out the exact color she wanted for her new convertible. Audrey had stood there clutching a glossy car brochure, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face, while I watched my future evaporate. He told me that family money belonged to the family and Audrey deserved to be happy. The painful humiliation of that day had fueled my entire career, pushing me to build a fortress they could never breach. Now, 15 years later, Richard was executing the exact same play. He was draining the family coffers to fund Audrey's extravagant lifestyle, but this time the price tag was not a used car. It was their entire existence. But Jamal's desperation to hack my accounts meant my parents' money was not enough to save him. I dug deeper into his flagship fund, determined to find the leak. I ran a standard liquidity ratio test against his filed SEC disclosures. The numbers did not just look wrong, they were physically impossible. Jamal was sending out glossy quarterly reports claiming a consistent 20% return in a highly volatile market, but his corporate accounts showed absolutely zero actual trading activity. There were no commercial real estate purchases, there were no bond acquisitions, there were only incoming wire transfers from new investors and outgoing wire transfers to old investors. He had fabricated a dozen offshore shell companies to hide the massive bleeding. The lucrative commercial real estate deal Richard always bragged about at family dinners was a complete phantom. Jamal was taking new money to pay off the earliest investors, skimming millions off the top to fund Audrey's designer shopping sprees and his own luxury car leases. I downloaded his complete transaction history, securing the hard evidence on an encrypted drive. Every fake invoice, every altered bank statement, every fraudulent signature was meticulously cataloged in my system. The gaping black hole in his ledger was expanding exponentially. The new deposits had completely dried up, and a massive payout was scheduled for the end of the month. He was out of cash, out of time, and backed into a corner. He was running a massive, catastrophic Ponzi scheme. He had trapped my parents in a web of deceit, but he had made a fatal error by targeting me. To keep himself out of federal prison, he had decided my $18 million estate was going to be his final bailout. The very next evening, I sat at a private table inside one of the most expensive steakhouses in downtown Chicago. This mandatory family dinner was supposed to be a celebration paid for by the very funds Jamal was currently embezzling. I sat quietly sipping my sparkling water, watching the performance unfold. I needed to test the waters to see exactly how deep my parents were buried in Jamal's financial grave. Richard sat at the head of the table holding a glass of imported scotch, radiating an unearned arrogance. Patricia sat next to him wearing a diamond necklace that I suspected was financed by fraudulent returns. Audrey was busy taking photos of her lobster tail for social media, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxury lifestyle was built on a foundation of stolen money. Jamal was the star of the night. He held court, pouring expensive wine and soaking up the adoration. I watched him closely. His tailored suit and million-dollar smile hid the desperate panic I had witnessed in his digital ledgers just 24 hours earlier. I knew he was drowning, but I needed to see how far he was willing to drag my parents down with him. Richard clinked his silver fork against his crystal glass to command the table's attention. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure the affluent patrons and waiters nearby could hear his booming voice. He proposed a toast to Jamal. Richard proudly announced that his brilliant son-in-law had just closed a massive commercial real estate acquisition in the financial district. A deal that would cement the family legacy for generations. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I knew for a fact that the real estate deal did not exist. It was a phantom transaction created to hide a massive liquidity gap in his Ponzi scheme, but Richard believed it completely. He turned his heavy gaze toward me. His tone shifted from celebratory to demanding. He pointed his steak knife in my direction and stated that it was time for me to stop playing it safe. He told me that my money was stagnating in conservative accounts. Richard declared that I needed to leverage my downtown penthouse immediately. He wanted me to take out a maximum equity line of credit and wire the funds directly into Jamal's new real estate venture by Monday morning. He framed it as a rare opportunity, an exclusive favor Jamal was doing for the family, but his eyes told a different story. He was demanding compliance. I set my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. The clink of the glass was the only sound in the sudden silence. I looked directly at Jamal, watching a muscle twitch in his jaw. Then I looked at my father. I flatly refused. I told him my penthouse was fully paid off, and I had absolutely no intention of leveraging my primary residence for a speculative venture I had not personally vetted. The temperature at the table plummeted. Patricia slammed her wineglass down so hard the stem nearly snapped. The dark red liquid splashed onto the white linen like a fresh wound. She leaned forward, her face twisting with a sudden vicious anger. She called me a selfish spinster. She sneered that my obsession with my career had made me cold and calculating. Patricia raised her voice, accusing me of wanting to see my own family fail out of pure jealousy, because Audrey had a husband and a beautiful life while I had nothing but bank statements. She pointed a manicured finger at my face and declared that family money belongs to the family. She said my assets were a shared resource, and it was my duty to support my sister's husband. Audrey chimed in, rolling her eyes and calling me a paranoid hoarder. She told me I was embarrassing them by acting like a poverty-stricken teenager. They attacked me with practiced precision, using the same emotional abuse they had relied on since I was a child. They fully expected me to cave under the weight of their collective disapproval. They expected me to hand over the keys to my financial kingdom just to buy their temporary affection. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my lifestyle choices or my relationship status. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I dropped it squarely onto the center of my untouched porcelain plate. I stood up and pushed my heavy oak chair back. I looked down at Patricia and Richard, letting my eyes convey absolute icy resolve. I told them very clearly that my estate was not a family bailout fund. I told them that my money was earned through my own brilliance and hard work, and I would never surrender a single cent to fund a lifestyle they could not actually afford. I slowly turned and walked away, leaving them completely speechless in the middle of the crowded restaurant. I handed my ticket to the valet outside and waited in the crisp Chicago night air. I heard rapid footsteps echoing on the concrete behind me. Jamal had followed me out. The charming corporate golden boy persona had completely vanished. His face was flushed, and his eyes were wild with a feral, desperate panic. He stepped uncomfortably close to me, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice to a menacing hiss. Jamal told me I was making a massive mistake. He threatened to go to my parents and tell them I was suffering from severe paranoia. He promised to use his connections to have my professional licenses investigated if I did not cooperate and wire him the funds by Monday. He smiled a cold, predatory grimace and whispered that nobody would ever believe a lonely, bitter woman over the family's favorite son. He told me he always got what he wanted, and I was going to give him my money whether I liked it or not. The sharp morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Artisan Cafe on Michigan Avenue. Natalie sat at a secluded corner table, the bitter taste of last night's confrontation still lingering in her mouth. The memory of Jamal cornering her in the dark alleyway, his charming corporate facade replaced by the feral desperation of a cornered animal, played on a continuous loop in her mind. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her double espresso, welcoming the harsh caffeine hit. She needed a moment of absolute silence to strategize her next move against her family. The heavy glass door of the cafe suddenly swung open, shattering the quiet atmosphere. The loud, aggressive clattering of high heels against polished concrete announced the arrival of the one person Natalie wanted to see least. Audrey marched into the cafe. She was not just walking, she was parading. Audrey carried half a dozen oversized, glossy designer shopping bags hooked over her forearms. The distinct, recognizable logos of European fashion houses practically screamed for attention. The thick paper bags rustled obnoxiously as she navigated through the crowded tables. Audrey wore oversized sunglasses indoors, a pristine cashmere coat draped carelessly over her shoulders, and a heavy diamond tennis bracelet catching the bright morning light. She spotted Natalie immediately. Audrey did not ask for permission to join her. She dropped the heavy luxury shopping bags onto the empty chair across from Natalie. The bags hit the wood with a loud, expensive thud. Audrey pulled out the adjacent chair and sat down, removing her sunglasses with a theatrical, exhausted sigh. She looked at Natalie with absolute, unmasked disgust. She did not offer a greeting. She immediately demanded an apology. She stated that Jamal was pacing their bedroom all night, physically sick with stress because of Natalie's selfish and erratic behavior at the steakhouse. Audrey leaned across the small bistro table, invading Natalie's personal space. She aggressively explained that Jamal was managing high-level corporate transitions and required immediate capital to smooth over a temporary liquidity issue. She spoke the financial terms clumsily, eagerly regurgitating the fabricated lies Jamal had fed her to justify his desperate need for a massive cash injection. Audrey declared that the family had convened after Natalie stormed out of the restaurant and made a collective decision. She commanded Natalie to sign over the full authorization of her liquid assets to Jamal's firm by the end of the business day. Audrey framed the extortion as a mandatory family contribution. She stated that if Natalie refused to be a team player, their parents were prepared to take immediate and devastating legal measures. Audrey smiled, a sharp, venomous curling of her lips. She revealed that Richard and Patricia were already in contact with a ruthless probate attorney. They were drafting an emergency petition to have Natalie legally declared mentally incompetent. Audrey leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. She told Natalie not to look so shocked. She reminded Natalie of exactly how this family operated when they were defied. Audrey brought up the summer Natalie turned 16, using the painful memory like a blunt weapon. "We told everyone you were sick. We told everyone you were unstable. We told everyone you were a danger to yourself." Audrey repeated the phrases with terrifying, sadistic delight. "We paid the doctors, we signed the papers, we locked you away." Audrey bragged about how effortless it had been for Richard to convince a sympathetic judge that a rebellious, emotional teenager lacked the mental capacity to manage the lucrative trust fund their grandfather had left behind. Audrey reminded Natalie that they drained that money to save Richard's failing hardware business and to buy Audrey her first luxury car. Nobody questioned them. Nobody questioned the wealthy, respectable parents. Nobody believed the hysterical, isolated teenager locked inside a residential facility. Audrey sat back, crossing her arms with absolute blinding triumph. She stated that blood always wins. She promised that if Natalie forced their hand today, they would drag her into court, completely destroy her professional reputation, and seize control of her estate the exact same way they had done it before. Natalie felt the phantom weight of that old trauma pressing heavily against her chest. The memory of being trapped in that sterile facility, while her family stole her inheritance, was a dark, suffocating anchor. But the woman sitting in the cafe was no longer a frightened 16-year-old girl. Natalie was a master forensic accountant. She possessed a weapon none of them could possibly comprehend. Natalie thought about the encrypted drive sitting securely in her home safe. She thought about the digital bloodbath she had uncovered on Jamal's private server just 72 hours ago. She looked at Audrey's glossy designer shopping bags, realizing with cold clarity that they were purchased with stolen money. Audrey was wearing stolen diamonds. Audrey was boasting about a lifestyle financed entirely by a collapsing Ponzi scheme. Natalie felt no fear. She only felt a cold, absolute certainty. She looked at her sister not as a terrifying authority figure, but as a walking liability, a completely unaware participant in massive federal fraud. Natalie picked up her porcelain cup and took one final deliberate sip of her espresso. She set the cup down gently on the saucer, the ceramic clinking softly. She reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it under her empty cup to cover the check. She stood up smoothly, adjusting her collar. She looked down at her sister. Audrey was still smirking, waiting for the inevitable submission, waiting for the familiar tears of defeat. Natalie leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, bringing her face inches from Audrey's. She looked Audrey dead in the eye, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. Natalie told her sister to enjoy the designer bags. She told her to enjoy the imported cashmere coat and the heavy diamond bracelet. She advised Audrey to cherish every single luxury item sitting on that chair, because by the end of the week, every single one of her platinum credit cards was going to bounce. Natalie turned on her heel and walked out of the cafe, leaving Audrey staring after her in stunned, bewildered silence. 48 hours before my scheduled flight to Zurich, I bypassed my usual downtown office and took a private elevator straight to the secure boardroom of my legal counsel. The room was a fortress of soundproof glass and polished walnut designed specifically for the kind of high-stakes corporate warfare my family was completely oblivious to. Oliver, my lead corporate attorney, was already waiting. He was a man who charged $1,000 an hour and rarely showed emotion, but as I slid my encrypted laptop across the table, his usual stoic expression tightened. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I brought up the digital logs showing Jamal's relentless unauthorized pings against my primary banking routing numbers. Then I pulled up the intercepted emails I had routed from my mother's unsecured home network. The attachments displayed a forged psychological evaluation meticulously drafted and already signed by a disgraced physician on Jamal's payroll. They were explicitly detailing my supposed mental instability, framing my recent financial independence as severe paranoia and a dangerous manic episode. My family had laid the groundwork flawlessly, using the exact same legal playbook they had weaponized against me when I was 16. Oliver reviewed the documents, his eyes scanning the fraudulent medical claims and the attached emergency petition for a medical power of attorney. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a gold pen against the polished wood table. The silence stretched between us, thick with the gravity of the situation. Oliver did not sugarcoat his assessment. He told me that Patricia and Richard had orchestrated a surprisingly sophisticated legal trap. He warned me that if Patricia managed to file this emergency petition with the state court on Friday morning, the judge would likely grant a temporary injunction. The state would immediately freeze my personal and business accounts, pending a formal psychological evaluation. That temporary freeze was all the window Jamal needed. Oliver explained the mechanics of the trap with chilling precision. Jamal was a licensed wealth manager, and with Patricia holding a temporary medical power of attorney, Jamal could bypass standard institutional delays. He could execute an immediate, irrevocable wire transfer under the guise of consolidating my assets for protective medical care. By the time I could get a lawyer in front of a judge on Monday to contest the fraudulent evaluation, my $18 million estate would be absorbed into Jamal's collapsing Ponzi scheme. The money would be scattered across a dozen offshore shell companies, completely unrecoverable. They were banking on the legal system moving slower than their theft. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, not from fear, but from the sheer breathtaking audacity of their greed. My own mother was willing to legally strip me of my human rights, to lock me in a cage of medical bureaucracy, just to hand my life savings over to her golden son-in-law. I looked at Oliver and told him it was time to initiate the final contingency plan. We had discussed theoretical asset protection before, but this required immediate scorched earth execution. I authorized the financial ghost protocol. Oliver immediately opened his secure terminal and began drafting the transfer orders. We spent the next 4 hours systematically dismantling my entire financial footprint. I authorized the transfer of my entire $18 million estate out of all vulnerable personal and corporate accounts. We moved every single cent into a highly specialized, irrevocable blind trust based in Delaware. The structure of this specific trust was impenetrable. Once the funds crossed the threshold, I legally surrendered direct management control to a sovereign board of trustees. It completely shielded the capital from any familial legal claims, civil suits, or most importantly, any fraudulent medical power of attorney. If Patricia walked into a bank with a court order demanding access to my wealth, the bank managers would find absolutely nothing to hand over. My financial existence within their jurisdictional reach was being completely vaporized. I watched the transfer bars load on Oliver's screen, representing a decade of relentless corporate maneuvering, sleepless nights, and hard-earned victories. The progress bar hit 100%. The funds vanished from my traditional accounts. I was officially a financial ghost. They could legally declare me incompetent. They could drag my name through the mud, but they could not touch a single dime. The immense weight of anticipating their betrayal finally lifted from my shoulders, replaced by the thrilling anticipation of their impending destruction. With my actual wealth safely fortified behind a wall of Delaware corporate law, we needed to ensure my family remained completely blind to my defensive maneuvers until it was too late for them to pivot. If Jamal realized the money was gone today, he might flee the country before his Ponzi scheme collapsed. I needed him to stay right here, desperately clinging to the illusion that he was about to hit the jackpot. Oliver reached into his desk and pulled out a stack of crisp, watermarked financial documents. He slid them across the table. I picked them up and closely examined the pristine pages. They were official bank statements and routing documents featuring my name and corporate letterheads. Oliver explained that he had opened a series of dummy accounts. These accounts possessed active, fully verifiable routing numbers that would easily pass any superficial institutional background check. However, these accounts held exactly $0. They were hollow digital shells, designed specifically to capture and trap an unauthorized wire attempt. I took the documents and folded them very carefully into my leather briefcase. I knew exactly where to put them. I would deliberately leave the entire stack resting plainly inside the top drawer of my home office desk. It was the most obvious place a frantic, greedy family would look. I knew for a fact that Patricia still possessed a spare key to my house, a key she falsely claimed she kept only for trivial maintenance emergencies while I was traveling on business. The trap was perfectly set. Natalie walked through the first-class terminal at O'Hare International Airport. The chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases and frantic announcements faded into white noise. For the first time in 32 years, she felt absolutely weightless. The heavy, suffocating mantle of family obligation had been left behind in a secure Delaware blind trust, and a stack of utterly useless bank statements sitting in her desk drawer. She bypassed the crowded, noisy food courts and hurried lines her leather tote bag slung over her shoulder, containing nothing but her laptop, her passport, and a one-way ticket to Zurich. She had spent her entire life shrinking herself to fit into the cramped, critical boxes her parents had built for her. She had endured the sneers, the financial demands, and the constant comparisons to Audrey. Today, she was simply walking away. She reached the exclusive airline lounge, handing her boarding pass to the attendant. As the velvet rope opened, her smartphone began to vibrate violently in her pocket. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. The fallout had begun right on schedule. Natalie stepped into a quiet alcove near the lounge's towering glass windows, watching a massive jet taxi across the tarmac. She let the phone ring 4 times before finally swiping to answer. She did not offer a greeting. She simply brought the receiver to her ear and waited. Richard did not disappoint. His voice erupted through the speaker, breathless, erratic, and vibrating with unhinged fury. He shouted her name completely devoid of paternal warmth. He was calling from the emergency wing of Chicago Memorial Hospital. Patricia had just regained consciousness after a massive stress-induced fainting spell. The medical crisis was entirely secondary to Richard's blinding financial panic. He demanded the money. He screamed into the phone, the hospital acoustics echoing his rage, accusing Natalie of being a deceitful, ungrateful thief. He demanded to know how she could be so heartless as to hide her assets from her parents when they were trying to secure a future for her sister. Richard yelled that she had sabotaged a multi-million-dollar real estate venture, deliberately humiliating Jamal and leaving the family financially exposed. He ordered her to immediately reverse whatever malicious banking lock she had initiated and authorize the transfer now. He threatened to call the police and report the funds as stolen. Natalie stood perfectly still, her reflection calm in the airport window. She let him exhaust his breath. When he finally paused, panting heavily into the receiver, she replied with a cold, unwavering clarity. She informed her father that theft by legal definition requires taking something that actually belongs to someone else. She reminded him that every single dollar in her estate was earned through her own forensic accounting firm, built without a single cent of his support. She stated that her money was not a communal family bailout fund to be harvested whenever his golden son-in-law ran short on cash. Natalie then offered a piece of practical advice. She suggested that instead of screaming at her from a hospital waiting room, Richard should turn around, look his perfect son-in-law in the eye, and ask Jamal where the family's actual money went. She told Richard to ask Jamal about the second mortgage on the Beacon Hill estate. The line went dead quiet for 2 agonizing seconds. Natalie could hear the muffled, frantic whispering on the other end, the sudden shift in proximity as the phone was forcefully snatched from Richard's hand. When the voice returned, it was no longer her father's arrogant blustering. It was Jamal. The charismatic, polished corporate savior had completely dropped his charming facade. His voice was a low, venomous snarl, raw with cornered desperation. He did not bother with pleasantries or fake family unity. He demanded to know what she had done with the offshore routing numbers. He accused her of breaching federal banking laws, claiming her little stunt with the blind trust was a temporary roadblock he would easily crush by Monday morning. Jamal leaned into the receiver, his breathing heavy, and promised to completely destroy her. He threatened to use his elite network to blacklist her firm. He swore he would drag her name through the financial mud, fabricating audits and planting stories until she was ruined and begging for a job. He told her she was a pathetic, jealous woman who had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Natalie listened to his feral threats completely unaffected. She took a slow sip of the sparkling water a lounge attendant had just handed her. She smiled a genuine expression of absolute victory. She told Jamal his threats were meaningless because he no longer had a professional network. She calmly explained that while he was busy trying to drain her accounts with a fraudulent power of attorney, she had been doing her actual job. She told him that fake commercial real estate deals and offshore shell companies leave massive digital footprints if you know exactly where to look. She stated that transferring new investor capital to pay off old clients is the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme, and he had executed his with remarkable sloppiness. Jamal stopped breathing. The silence on the line was absolute heavy with the crushing weight of his impending doom. Natalie delivered the final fatal blow with surgical precision. She advised Jamal to stop worrying about her empty bank accounts and start worrying about his own freedom. She calmly instructed him to go check his primary office email. She informed him that precisely 3 minutes ago she had forwarded a fully decrypted copy of his real accounting ledgers, including every fake invoice and stolen family mortgage document. She had sent the entire forensic dossier to his inbox. She had graciously blind copied the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and every single one of his top-tier investors. Natalie pulled the phone away from her ear, hit the red end call button, and walked toward her boarding gate. Natalie handed her passport to the gate agent, stepping onto the jet bridge with profound liberation. The air inside the first-class cabin was cool and smelled of expensive citrus. She settled into her spacious leather pod, stowed her bag, and accepted a flute of sparkling water. For the past decade, she had carried the suffocating weight of her family's relentless demands. That era was officially dead. As the jet pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway, she leaned her head against the window. She watched the Chicago skyline fade into the distance. She was heading to Switzerland to meet a new consortium of international clients, her professional reputation immaculate, and her $18 million estate locked inside an impenetrable legal vault. She closed her eyes, feeling the powerful thrust of the engines as the plane lifted off the tarmac. She executed the financial ghost protocol flawlessly. Now, she simply had to let gravity do its work on the people she left behind. Meanwhile, chaos was unfolding in downtown Chicago. Jamal drove his leased sports car with reckless speed. He swerved violently through the morning traffic, ignoring blaring horns and red lights. Sweat drenched the collar of his shirt. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The polished corporate mastermind had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified criminal realizing the walls were closing in. He slammed his car into the VIP parking spot of his office building, not bothering to straighten the wheels. He sprinted through the marble lobby, shoving past bewildered executives and ignoring the greetings. He hammered the elevator button repeatedly, muttering curses under his breath. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, he burst out and ran straight past his startled receptionist. He threw open the heavy glass doors of his corner office, slammed them shut behind him, and threw himself into his desk chair. Jamal frantically booted up his encrypted workstation. His fingers shook violently as he navigated to his private inbox. Natalie's email was sitting right at the top. The subject line was blank. He clicked it open and the breath was punched out of his lungs. Natalie had forensically dismantled his entire life. The attached dossier was a masterpiece of financial destruction. It contained a comprehensive flowchart mapping his fraudulent shell companies, explicitly referencing the ledgers in Duyen Mao 1_13.docs. It showed the dates and times he had illegally siphoned capital from unsuspecting clients to pay fabricated returns to his oldest investors. The architecture of a massive Ponzi scheme was laid bare, corroborated by the forensic data within Duyen Mao 2_13.docx. He scrolled down, his vision blurring with panic. The ledger detailed phantom commercial real estate acquisitions invented to cover a bleeding liquidity gap, meticulously cross-referenced with Duyen Mao 3_13.doc. He desperately needed Natalie's $18 million by this Friday. That money was not an investment. It was a critical survival mechanism required to pacify his backers and keep the fraudulent operation running. Without her capital, the entire house of cards would violently collapse. He scrolled to the bottom of the email and saw the recipients list along with the final exhibit, Duyen Mao 4_13.docs. Natalie had blind copied the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, and his three largest private investors. A cold wave of terror washed over him. The authorities had the evidence. The investors knew their money was gone. There were no more lies to spin. Before Jamal could formulate an exit strategy, the heavy glass door of his office was forcefully shoved open. Audrey stormed into the room, radiating indignation. She did not notice his pale face. She did not notice the damning financial ledgers illuminating his monitor. Audrey was entirely consumed by her own inconvenience. She marched straight up to his desk, slamming her designer handbag down onto the polished wood. She crossed her arms, her face contorted in a furious scowl. Audrey demanded to know what was wrong with the bank accounts. She shrieked that she had just endured the most humiliating experience of her life at the luxury car dealership. She explained she had spent 2 hours customizing a convertible, intending to purchase it outright. When she handed over her premium platinum card to the sales manager, the machine had loudly and publicly declined the transaction. She yelled the manager had looked at her like a common thief. Audrey demanded that Jamal pick up the phone immediately. She commanded him to scream at the bank executives and fix whatever administrative error caused her card to bounce. She insisted he wire the funds to the dealership right now so she could drive her new car to lunch. Jamal stared at his wife. He looked at her expensive blowout, her perfectly manicured nails, and the outrage burning in her eyes. The profound disconnect between her rage and the catastrophic reality of their situation broke something inside his brain. The glamorous, wealthy facade they had built together was dead, and she was the only one who did not know it yet. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her that there was no bank error, that the platinum cards were useless, that the money was a mirage, and that they were both about to lose everything. Before a word could leave his mouth, the red light on his desk intercom began flashing frantically. A sharp, loud buzz cut through the heavy tension in the office. Jamal slowly reached forward and pressed the speaker button. His secretary's voice echoed through the room. She was not using her standard cheerful tone. Her voice was thin, trembling, and laced with absolute terror. She whispered that she was incredibly sorry to interrupt, but 3 men had just bypassed the security desk and walked straight into the reception area. They were Jamal's 3 biggest private investors. They had received Natalie's email. They were refusing to wait. They were refusing to leave, and they were demanding their money back immediately. Patricia ripped the intravenous line from her hand the second the nurse turned away. The sting of the needle was eclipsed by the rage consuming her chest. She ignored the heart monitor and swung her legs over the hospital bed. Richard stood by the window, pale with sweat, stammering about doctor recommendations. Patricia silenced him with a venomous glare. She demanded her coat. There was absolutely no time for medical coddling. Natalie had dared to hide the family money. Patricia was going to march into the bank holding her daughter's accounts and rectify this insolence. Richard scrambled to obey, casting anxious glances at the door. They slipped out of the emergency ward, bypassing the nurses entirely. Richard drove his luxury sedan with reckless urgency, weaving through midday Chicago traffic toward the downtown financial district. Patricia sat in the passenger seat, smoothing a manila envelope on her lap. Inside was the forged medical power of attorney and the fabricated psychological evaluation drafted by Jamal's corrupt physician. It was their ultimate weapon. Patricia rehearsed her performance, preparing to unleash her affluent mother persona upon whatever bank employee stood in her way. She was ready to tear the bank apart vault by vault. They breached the brass doors of the downtown branch with the arrogance of people who own the building. Patricia bypassed the line of waiting customers, marching straight to the polished mahogany desk of the head teller. She slammed the manila folder down on the immaculate glass surface. She demanded the immediate presence of the senior branch manager. The teller blinked, momentarily stunned by the hostility of the woman standing before her. Patricia leaned forward, her voice a sharp whip. She announced that this was a medical emergency regarding a high-net-worth client experiencing a severe psychological breakdown. As the mother holding power of attorney, she required access to Natalie's accounts to prevent her unstable daughter from squandering the estate. The teller, intimidated by the mention of massive wealth, frantically dialed the phone. Within seconds, a man in a charcoal suit rushed out, introducing himself as Marcus Vance, the branch manager. Marcus politely guided them away from the staring lobby and into his private soundproof office. Patricia did not wait for an invitation to sit. She dropped into the leather chair opposite his desk and shoved the forged documents across the table. She commanded Marcus to freeze Natalie's accounts and authorize a wire transfer consolidating the funds into Jamal's firm. Marcus adjusted his glasses and reviewed the documents provided by Patricia. He opened his secure terminal and typed in the account routing numbers listed on the paperwork Patricia had snatched from Natalie's home desk drawer. He stared at the screen, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He looked up at Patricia and Richard, his voice carefully neutral. He informed them that the accounts listed on the routing documents were indeed active and registered to Natalie. However, he stated clearly that the current balance across every single one of those accounts was exactly $0. Patricia let out an incredulous laugh. She slammed her hand flat against the desk. She told Marcus to stop playing games and override whatever ridiculous privacy locks Natalie had initiated. Richard joined the assault, his face turning red. He yelled that his daughter was suffering from a manic episode and had maliciously hidden $18 million. He demanded that the bank run a full diagnostic trace to locate the offshore holding accounts immediately. Patricia insisted the money was rightfully theirs to manage and demanded administrative action. She spoke with blinding entitlement, completely convinced that the sheer force of her anger would compel the bank to bypass federal regulations. Marcus Vance remained perfectly still, absorbing their aggressive barrage without flinching. He looked back down at the medical evaluation and the power of attorney. He was not just a branch manager. He was a veteran financial officer trained to spot inconsistencies. His eyes locked onto the raised embossed seal at the bottom of the psychological evaluation. The state medical board insignia was slightly off-center, and the specific licensing font utilized by the physician did not match the standardized state registry formats he handled daily. The notary stamp on the power of attorney lacked the microscopic watermark required by the state of Illinois for documents executing wealth transfers exceeding $10 million. Marcus saw the trap. He recognized the desperate, sloppy hallmarks of an attempted massive financial heist. He did not confront them. He did not voice his suspicions. Instead, Marcus closed the folder with a soft, reassuring click. He looked at Patricia and offered her a warm, highly professional smile. He apologized profusely for the technical delays, claiming that high-yield transfers required a secondary managerial clearance code from the regional director. He politely asked them to remain comfortably in his office while he stepped into the secure communications room to push the override through. He offered them freshly brewed espresso to make their wait more comfortable. Patricia leaned back in her chair, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face as Marcus exited the room and closed the heavy door behind him. She felt the familiar rush of absolute control returning to her veins. Richard paced the length of the plush office, his chest puffed out with arrogant satisfaction. He looked at Patricia and declared that the moment the bank located the hidden funds, they would call the judge. He boasted that they would have Natalie committed to a psychiatric ward the second her flight landed back on American soil. He promised that Natalie would spend the next 5 years heavily medicated and completely silenced exactly where she belonged. Outside the soundproof office, Marcus Vance did not walk toward the communications room. He marched directly into his private security vestibule and locked the door. He picked up the red emergency phone on the wall. He did not dial the regional director. He dialed the direct federal financial fraud hotline, requesting an immediate armed FBI response unit. The tires of the transatlantic jet touched down on the pristine tarmac of Zurich Airport with a muted thud. Natalie stepped off the plane into the crisp mountain air, her mind remarkably clear. The exhaustion that typically accompanied a long international flight was entirely absent, replaced by a crystalline sense of purpose. She bypassed the standard baggage claims, having packed nothing but her leather tote, and moved swiftly through customs. A sleek black town car was already waiting at the arrivals curb. She slid into the leather back seat, watching the immaculate Swiss landscape roll past the tinted windows. The serene waters of Lake Zurich sparkled under the midday sun, a stark contrast to the toxic, frantic energy she had left behind in Illinois. Within 40 minutes, the car pulled up to the grand entrance of a historic luxury hotel. The concierge greeted her by name, whisking her past the reception desk and directly up to the penthouse suite she had booked months in advance under a corporate alias. Natalie stepped into the massive suite and locked the heavy oak door behind her. The room was a masterpiece of minimalist elegance, featuring massive windows that offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the snow-capped Alps. She walked over to the glass, taking a slow, deep breath. The suffocating grip of her family dynamics was officially broken. She placed her tote bag on the polished mahogany dining table and extracted her secure laptop. She flipped the screen open, bypassing the biometric security locks, and connected to the encrypted virtual private network she had established for this exact moment. As the secure email client loaded, the notification bell chimed relentlessly. Her private inbox was completely flooded. There were 27 missed calls and 14 audio attachments forwarded from her secondary voicemail service. The caller identification belonged to Audrey. Natalie clicked the first audio file, leaning back in the plush dining chair. Her sister's voice erupted through the laptop speakers, completely devoid of its usual polished country club composure. Audrey sounded utterly unhinged, her words slurring together in a frantic, hysterical pitch. She screamed into the phone, accusing Natalie of orchestrating a malicious, jealous attack designed to ruin her perfect marriage. Audrey sobbed dramatically, claiming that Jamal was a brilliant, hard-working man who had simply fallen victim to a volatile real estate market. She insisted that transferring new investor capital to cover old debts was just a standard accounting maneuver that everyone in high finance utilized. Natalie listened to the delusions without a flinch. The second voicemail was even more frantic. Audrey demanded that Natalie immediately wire the $18 million to the holding company. She weaponized every manipulative tactic their mother had ever taught her, shrieking about family loyalty, sisterly duty, and the sacred obligation to protect their shared reputation. Audrey wailed that Natalie was being selfish and cruel, hoarding wealth, while her own family members faced a temporary cash flow problem. She promised that if Natalie just released the funds, the family would forgive her for her sudden, erratic disappearance. Audrey swore that Jamal would pay back every single cent with interest once his next phantom property development closed. Natalie calmly pressed the delete key, wiping the entire folder of voicemails from her server permanently. The emotional manipulation was pathetic, a desperate echo of the control her family had wielded over her for 32 years. Audrey was clinging to the sinking wreckage of her fraudulent luxury lifestyle, refusing to accept that the ship was already at the bottom of the ocean. Natalie did not feel a single ounce of guilt. She felt absolutely nothing for the woman who had spent a lifetime mocking her career and enabling their parents' financial abuse. She cracked her knuckles and opened a new, highly secured browser window. It was time to permanently seal the vault. Natalie navigated to the official whistleblower portal for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. She bypassed the standard complaint forms and accessed the priority upload gateway designed for licensed financial forensics experts. She attached the massive decrypted dossier she had compiled over the last 8 months. The files contained the raw, unfiltered truth of the Ponzi scheme. She uploaded the bank routing numbers, the forged offshore shell company, charters, the fabricated client return statements, and the explicit digital footprints tracing the stolen funds directly to personal accounts. She hit submit and watched the progress bar turn green, confirming the transfer to the federal database. Natalie did not stop there. She opened a second portal, this one connecting directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division in Chicago. She uploaded the exact same dossier, appending a sworn legally binding affidavit detailing her forensic findings. She included the metadata proving Jamal had attempted to illegally access her blind trust using unauthorized corporate credentials. She clicked the final submission button, locking the files into the federal server. The evidence was now in the hands of the most aggressive financial prosecutors in the country. Jamal was no longer dealing with a frustrated sister-in-law. He was facing the full, crushing weight of the United States federal government. She closed the browser, reached for the room service menu, and considered ordering a celebratory bottle of vintage champagne. Before her hand could even touch the telephone, her laptop screen flashed with a high-priority, red-bordered notification. It was a secure, automated alert triggered by her primary banking application in Chicago. Natalie leaned forward, her eyes scanning the encrypted text generated by Marcus Vance. The alert detailed a severe security protocol breach at the downtown branch. It confirmed that Patricia and Richard had attempted to execute a massive wire transfer using a forged medical power of attorney and fabricated psychological evaluations. Marcus had initiated the ultimate lockdown protocol. The notification confirmed that federal agents had just breached the bank lobby. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit was currently detaining Patricia and Richard inside the manager's office for an attempted federal wire fraud. The mahogany door of the branch manager office swung open with a sudden forceful click. Patricia Blackwell lowered her espresso cup, her triumphant smile freezing in place. Richard turned from the window, expecting to see Marcus Vance holding a confirmed wire transfer receipt. Instead, Marcus stepped aside, his face completely devoid of the deferential warmth he had displayed 10 minutes earlier. In his place stood 3 individuals wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and sharp analytical eyes, stepped into the room. She was flanked by 2 broad-shouldered agents who immediately moved to secure the exit. Patricia felt the expensive espresso turn to acid in her stomach. The plush, quiet luxury of the bank office suddenly felt like a concrete holding cell. The lead agent did not offer a polite greeting. She did not apologize for the interruption. She walked straight to the glass desk, picked up the manila folder containing the medical power of attorney, and looked directly at Richard. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense as the reality of their situation began to materialize. Richard recovered from his initial shock, his face flushing with indignant rage. He relied on the only defense mechanism he had ever known. He puffed out his chest, attempting to inflate his physical presence to match his perceived social status. He aggressively pointed his finger at the lead agent and demanded to know the meaning of this outrageous intrusion. He shouted that he was a senior executive with deep ties to the Chicago political elite, and that this bank had just made the most catastrophic mistake in its corporate history. He threatened to call his brigade of defense attorneys and sue the federal government for harassment, illegal detention, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He commanded the agents to step aside and ordered Marcus to finalize the $18 million transfer immediately. The lead agent remained perfectly still, letting Richard exhaust his breath. She did not flinch at his volume or his threats. When his shouting finally subsided into heavy, angry panting, she replied with a cold, unwavering calm. She introduced herself as Special Agent Reynolds from the White-Collar Crime Division. She informed Richard that screaming about his lawyers was highly advisable, considering the severity of his current predicament. Agent Reynolds clearly stated that attempting to seize liquid assets across state and international lines using fraudulent medical documentation was a federal offense. She explained that wire fraud combined with the presentation of forged state medical seals carried a mandatory minimum sentence that his expensive lawyers could not simply negotiate away. Patricia gripped the armrests of her leather chair so tightly, her manicured nails dug into the upholstery. The confident facade she had worn into the bank was shattering piece by piece. Agent Reynolds opened the manila folder and laid the documents flat on the desk. She pointed a pen at the psychological evaluation. She calmly explained that the federal database had already run a preliminary background check on the physician listed on the letterhead. The doctor had surrendered his medical license 3 years ago, following a massive prescription fraud scandal. Furthermore, the notary's stamp on the power of attorney belonged to a firm that had been dissolved by the state during a massive embezzlement probe. Agent Reynolds looked between the two of them, her gaze piercing through their wealthy exterior. She bluntly asked them who had supplied the fabricated documents. Richard stubbornly crossed his arms, his arrogance blinding his logic. He doubled down on the lie, insisting the paperwork was legitimate and that Natalie was a danger to herself. He sneered that the federal government had no business interfering in private family matters. He demanded they release the funds to protect his daughter. Agent Reynolds simply pulled out a pair of evidence bags and carefully slid the forged documents inside. She informed Richard that lying to a federal agent during an active fraud investigation was another felony charge to add to his rapidly growing list. The mention of felony charges in federal prison finally broke Patricia. The perfectly constructed image of her superior, untouchable life crumbled under the crushing weight of impending ruin. She could not go to prison. She could not lose her country club membership, her Beacon Hill estate, and her flawless social standing. Panic seized her throat. She stood up abruptly, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at her husband. She screamed that they had nothing to do with creating the documents. Patricia blurted out the truth in a rapid, desperate torrent of words. She confessed that Jamal had orchestrated the entire scheme. She sobbed that her perfect son-in-law had provided the disgraced doctor and the corrupt lawyer. She admitted they knew the medical evaluation was a complete fabrication. Patricia wept openly, her makeup running down her face, confessing that Jamal desperately needed Natalie's money to cover a massive shortfall in his investment firm. She wailed that they only went along with the forged power of attorney because they needed to secure the funds to keep the family wealthy. They could not let Audrey lose her luxury lifestyle. Agent Reynolds sealed the plastic evidence bags with a sharp, decisive zip. She handed them to the junior agent standing by the door. She turned back to the trembling couple, her expression entirely devoid of sympathy. She informed Richard and Patricia they were incredibly fortunate today. She stated that because the wire transfer had been successfully intercepted before any capital was moved, she was not going to place them under arrest this afternoon. Patricia gasped, sagging against Richard in a wave of profound, nauseating relief. Agent Reynolds stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. She told them their freedom was entirely temporary. She instructed Richard to pull out his phone. She demanded the exact address of their son-in-law's wealth management firm. The heavy, agonizing thud of Jamal hitting the manual override button on his industrial shredder echoed through the massive corner office. The machine whined in protest, violently choking on thick, incriminating stacks of fabricated quarterly returns and offshore routing documents. Jamal ripped a jammed cluster of papers from the feeding slot, his hands bleeding from deep paper cuts he did not even feel. The polished mahogany floor was already covered in a thick snowstorm of shredded lies. Across the room, Audrey sat curled into a tight ball on the white leather sofa. The furious, entitled woman who had stormed in just 20 minutes prior, demanding a luxury convertible and berating him over a declined platinum card, was entirely gone. In her place sat a hollow, trembling shell, her expensive designer makeup smeared across her pale cheeks. The catastrophic reality of their total financial ruin had finally pierced her thick armor of delusion. Jamal had spent the last 20 minutes frantically confessing the absolute truth. He had told her about the heavily leveraged properties, the missing investor capital, and the fake ledgers. He admitted, his voice breaking, that her platinum cards were permanently dead. Their bank accounts were locked, and the luxury lifestyle she demanded had been funded entirely by stolen money. Audrey stared at her husband, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, as the crushing, suffocating weight of poverty settled onto her shoulders. Outside the heavy glass doors of the executive suite, the chaotic shouting of the angry investors in the lobby suddenly went dead silent. A synchronized chorus of heavy, tactical boots thudded against the marble floors of the reception area. The elevator banks had been forcefully locked down, and a dozen federal agents wearing dark jackets swarmed the 50th floor. They moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency, securing every exit and ordering the terrified corporate staff away from their desks. The thick glass doors to Jamal's private office were violently shoved open, shattering the heavy brass lock mechanism. Jamal froze like a cornered animal, a stack of damning wire transfer receipts clutched desperately in his bleeding hands. A senior tactical agent operating on the direct intelligence just extracted from Patricia and Richard at the bank led the raid. He did not bother with pleasantries or corporate courtesy. He commanded his team to secure the perimeter and seize every single digital asset in the room. Agents immediately descended upon Jamal's desk, ripping the power cords from his encrypted servers and confiscating his primary workstation. Two agents hauled the industrial shredder away from the wall, meticulously sealing the bags of destroyed documents into clear, tamper-proof evidence containers. Jamal stumbled backward, his back hitting the floor-to-ceiling window. He opened his mouth to deploy his signature corporate charm, to weave a desperate story about compliance audits and clerical errors. But the words died in his dry, panicked throat. The senior agent stepped squarely into Jamal's personal space. He instructed the ruined executive to place his hands behind his back. The cold, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Jamal's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the silent office. The sharp sound shattered Audrey's catatonic state. She erupted from the leather sofa, a primal, guttural scream tearing from her lungs. She launched herself across the room, her manicured hands grabbing frantically at the tactical vests of the arresting agents. She wildly attempted to physically pull the heavily armed men away from her husband, screaming that this was a massive, humiliating misunderstanding. Audrey shrieked that they were ruining a respectable businessman, that Jamal was a good man who had simply made a few bad investments due to market volatility. She yelled that family was supposed to help family and that this could all be fixed. She pointed frantically at the ceiling, demanding the agents call her sister. She screamed that Natalie was a newly minted billionaire, that Natalie possessed $18 million in liquid assets, and that Natalie would gladly write a massive check to cover the missing funds and pay everyone back. The lead agent effortlessly sidestepped Audrey's flailing arms, directing a junior officer to physically restrain the hysterical woman. He completely ignored Audrey's delusional, frantic bargaining. He looked Jamal dead in the eye and coldly read him his Miranda rights, detailing his right to remain silent, as he was officially charged with massive federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The agents marched Jamal out of the corner office, parading him in handcuffs past his weeping secretary, the furious investors, and the stunned corporate staff. Audrey was left standing alone in the center of the devastated executive suite, trembling violently amid the confiscated servers, stripped hard drives, and scattered paper. She collapsed onto her bruised knees, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she pulled her smartphone from her discarded designer handbag. She blindly scrolled through her contacts, hitting the dial button for her father. The line rang twice before Richard answered, his voice breathless and ragged from his own humiliating encounter with federal agents at the downtown bank branch. Audrey sobbed hysterically into the receiver, her words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent rush. She wailed that Jamal had just been arrested by the FBI, that agents had seized the entire office, and that the firm was completely destroyed. She demanded that Richard immediately contact his elite lawyers and arrange a massive cash transfer to post Jamal's bail. She shrieked that they needed millions of dollars in liquid cash right this second to save the family from complete public ruin. On the other end of the line, standing paralyzed in the parking lot of the downtown bank, Richard felt a cold, paralyzing dread seep deep into his bones. He pulled the phone away from his ear completely, ignoring his daughter's desperate screeching pleas. With a trembling finger, he opened his primary banking application to check his available liquidity for a massive bail bond. He logged into his personal wealth management portal, the highly exclusive account that Jamal had been independently managing for the past 4 years. The screen slowly loaded, calculating his entire retirement portfolio, his liquid savings, and the massive equity lines tied to the Beacon Hill estate. Richard stopped breathing. The horrifying, undeniable truth materialized in glaring red digits across his high-resolution screen. Jamal had not just stolen from external investors to fund his fraudulent empire. Every single account Richard owned had been systematically drained, heavily leveraged, and completely zeroed out. The arrogant patriarch realized with crushing certainty that the family was absolutely destitute. Richard stood frozen in the bank parking lot. A violent tremor racked his body. His thumb hovered over his screen. Facial recognition engaged, unlocking his private wealth management application. The dashboard materialized. He blinked rapidly, commanding his brain to process the digits displayed across the white background. The primary checking account, which a week prior held over $400,000, showed a balance of negative $342. His heart slammed against his ribs. He tapped the screen, navigating to the joint investment portfolio. The diversified mutual funds, growth stocks, and municipal bonds they had accumulated over 4 decades were gone. The balance read zero. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him as he clicked the final tab. The home equity line of credit, tied directly to their Beacon Hill estate, was maxed out. 3 weeks ago, Jamal had convinced him to authorize a temporary bridge loan to cover a margin call. Jamal had sworn that the funds would be returned within 72 hours. Richard had signed the authorization papers, blinded by the promise of easy money and his unwavering belief in his son-in-law. Now staring at the red numbers indicating a fully drawn credit line of $6.5 million, the terrifying reality struck him. Jamal had intentionally bled them dry. They possessed zero liquid cash. They had no safety net. They were destitute. The phone pressed against Richard's ear vibrated with Audrey's hysterical screaming. She was demanding that he immediately wire bail money to the federal courthouse. She shrieked that Jamal could not spend a single night in a federal cell, claiming he was a businessman, targeted by bureaucrats. Richard could not force his vocal cords to produce a sound. He could not form the words to tell his daughter that he could not afford to post Jamal's bail. He could not afford a defense attorney. He could not even afford the gas required to drive his luxury sedan back to their mansion. He slowly lowered the phone, cutting off Audrey's wailing, and let his arm drop limply to his side. Patricia grabbed his forearm, her manicured nails digging painfully through the fabric of his suit jacket. She had escaped federal indictment inside the bank office, and her nerves were shattered. She shook him, demanding to know what Audrey was screaming about and why he looked like he had seen a ghost. Richard turned the smartphone toward her, shoving the screen into her line of sight. Patricia squinted at the display, her brow furrowing in confusion. She demanded that he refresh the application, insisting the bank servers were experiencing a glitch. She stated errors were unacceptable for clients of their caliber. Richard shook his head, his voice reduced to a rasp. He told her there was no glitch. He explained that Jamal had drained every account, maxed out the credit lines, and left them with nothing. The color drained from Patricia's face, leaving her cheeks looking ashen. She stared at the negative balances, her mind rejecting the evidence of their destruction. The defense mechanisms she had spent a lifetime perfecting engaged. She could not process the fact that she was broke. She could not accept that her social empire was built on stolen money. Instead of facing the reality of Jamal's calculated fraud, Patricia's mind sought a scapegoat. Her eyes hardened with clarity. She slapped the phone from Richard's hand and let out a cry. She blamed Natalie. Patricia paced the asphalt, her heels clicking as she worked herself into a frenzy of rage. She pointed her finger toward the sky, screaming that this nightmare was entirely Natalie's fault. She declared that if her daughter had followed instructions and handed over the $18 million from the blind trust, none of this humiliation would be happening. Patricia yelled that Natalie was deliberately withholding family resources out of jealousy. She rationalized that Jamal was a visionary who needed an influx of capital to stabilize his portfolio. In her logic, Natalie's refusal to finance their lifestyle was the reason federal agents had raided Jamal's office. Patricia wept, portraying herself as the victim of a child. She wailed that a dutiful daughter would have gladly surrendered her inheritance to protect her sister's marriage and preserve the family's reputation. Richard stood silently, absorbing the brunt of his wife's ranting. He did not have the strength to argue or point out the absurdity of her claims. His chest ached with pressure. As Patricia continued to shriek about demanding Natalie's return to fix this disaster, a chime erupted from Richard's phone. He slowly lifted the device, his eyes locking onto a new notification. It was an automated email flagged with urgency. The sender was the lending institution that held the mortgage on their Beacon Hill estate. He swiped the notification, opening the message. The legal text leaped off the screen, delivering the blow to his world. The email informed him that the primary debt obligations on his property had been legally bundled and recently sold to a private holding company. The ownership transition transferred all enforcement rights to the new entity. Richard's eyes frantically scanned the subsequent paragraphs, his blood turning to ice. The legal notice highlighted a severe breach of contract. Over the past 2 months, Richard had deliberately skipped their massive mortgage payments, rerouting every available dollar of liquid cash to Jamal to help him bridge his imaginary financial gaps. He had assumed his elite status with the bank would grant him a quiet grace period. He was catastrophically wrong. The ruthless new holding company operated with absolutely zero leniency. The email concluded with a brutal, non-negotiable declaration. Due to the consecutive missed payments and the severe depletion of the property's equity, the holding company was initiating an immediate accelerated foreclosure process. Richard stared at the bold letters, realizing they were not just broke. By the end of the week, they would be completely homeless, stripped of their precious wealth, and totally exposed. The crisp, alpine air of Zurich offered a stark contrast to the financial wreckage drowning her family in Chicago. Natalie sat on the balcony of her penthouse suite, a glass of Pinot Noir resting lightly in her hand. The setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks of the Swiss Alps in brilliant shades of violet and gold, casting a serene reflection across the surface of the lake below. She took a slow sip, savoring the absolute tranquility of her surroundings. For the first time in her life, her pulse was steady. The lifelong imperative to appease her parents, to mold herself into a convenient financial backstop for their lifestyle, was completely gone. She had successfully severed the toxic tether. Her encrypted laptop sat idle on the glass patio table, the federal confirmation receipts safely archived. The dominoes she had meticulously aligned had finally fallen, executing a flawless sequence of justice. Then the sharp vibration of her satellite phone shattered the evening silence. She glanced at the caller identification display. The screen flashed with a restricted Chicago area code. It was Richard. She let it ring 3 times, enjoying the undeniable shift in their power dynamic before finally swiping the screen to accept the call. There was no arrogant barking on the other end. There were no demands, no condescending lectures about family loyalty, and absolutely zero trace of the imperious patriarch who had confidently marched into a bank manager's office just 24 hours earlier to illegally seize her assets. Instead, Natalie heard the ragged, wet sound of a grown man weeping. "Natalie!" Richard choked out, his voice barely recognizable through his heavy sobs. "Please, please do not hang up on me. You have to listen." She did not speak. She simply leaned back against the plush cushions, letting the silence stretch and twist the knife. "We have absolutely nothing left!" Richard cried, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic, humiliated rush. "Jamal is gone. The federal agents took him away in handcuffs, right in front of Audrey. The magistrate denied his preliminary release because he is considered a massive flight risk with the offshore accounts. They froze everything, Natalie. Every single account. But it does not even matter because the accounts were already empty. He stole it all. The retirement funds, the investment portfolios, the mutual funds. It is all completely gone. Natalie took another slow sip of her wine, watching a boat cut a wake across the lake. It gets worse. Richard wept, his breathing turning into a panicked hyperventilation. The house. The bank sold our mortgage debt to a private holding firm. Jamal convinced me to leverage the estate for a bridge loan, and I missed the payments to cover his margins. The new holding company initiated accelerated foreclosure. They are taking the house. We cannot even afford to hire a defense attorney for Jamal, let alone pay the next mortgage installment to halt the seizure. We are entirely destitute. He paused, taking a deep, shuddering, desperate breath, preparing to deploy his final weapon. I am so sorry, Natalie. I am so incredibly sorry for what we did at the bank yesterday. Your mother and I were just terrified and desperate to keep the family afloat. Trying to force that medical power of attorney was a massive, unforgivable mistake. We were blind to his fraud and took it out on you. Please, you have to help us. You are the only one with liquid capital. We just need a loan to stop the foreclosure and secure basic legal counsel. I swear on my life we will pay you back every single dime. Natalie set her wine glass down on the glass table. The faint clink resonated through the phone speaker. She did not feel a single spark of sympathy for the broken man weeping into the receiver. Richard. Natalie said, her voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising register. An apology forced by bankruptcy is not an apology. It is a negotiation tactic. No, please, I mean it. He begged, his voice cracking. You are not sorry for attempting to commit wire fraud and steal my entire net worth, Natalie corrected him sharply. You are only sorry that the FBI intercepted you before the transaction cleared. You are sorry that the golden son-in-law you elevated above your own flesh and blood turned out to be a parasitic criminal who bled you completely dry. You spent my entire life calling my career a frivolous hobby, mocking my financial independence, and demanding that I conform to your twisted standard of success. She paused, ensuring every single word landed with maximum impact. You chose your allegiance when you walked into that bank with forged psychological evaluations declaring me incompetent. You decided my financial ruin was an acceptable price to pay for your continued comfort. You made those choices with complete clarity. Now you get to experience the unshielded consequences of your own arrogance. You gladly served me up as a sacrificial lamb to fund Audrey's luxury lifestyle. And now that the bill has finally come due, you want me to write the check. The answer is absolutely not. I will not send you a single dime. Before Richard could utter another pathetic sob, a violent scuffle echoed through the phone. Patricia snatched the receiver away from her husband, her voice erupting into a shrill, hysterical scream. You are an absolute monster, Patricia shrieked, pure venom lacing every syllable. You are deliberately making your own parents homeless out of pure vindictive spite. You could save us right now, but you are choosing to destroy this family. Natalie did not raise her voice. She stared out at the darkening Swiss horizon, a cold, calculated smile finally touching her lips. I am not destroying the family, Natalie replied smoothly. I am simply taking over the management. Go pack your bags. I will see you in exactly 1 week to discuss your housing situation. Natalie calmly ended the phone call. The 7 days following Natalie's departure felt less like a week and more like a slow, agonizing public execution for the remaining family members. The Chicago local news stations aggressively ripped into the story with unrelenting, vicious ferocity. Jamal's massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme quickly became the undisputed lead headline across every major network, broadcasted hourly. Reporters swarmed the downtown federal courthouse, capturing high-definition footage of Jamal being led away in heavy chains, his custom-tailored suits replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit. The news anchors detailed the sheer scale of the fraud, outlining how he systematically drained the life savings of local business owners, retired teachers, and his own affluent social circle to fund a facade of staggering wealth. For Patricia, the media circus was merely the precursor to her true nightmare, the complete annihilation of her social standing. Her phone, which usually buzzed incessantly with invitations to charity galas and exclusive luncheons, went completely dead. The final blow came Thursday morning via a coldly worded, hand-delivered letter. The Elite Country Club Board, a group Patricia had ruled with an iron fist for a decade, unceremoniously stripped her of her directorial position and revoked her membership entirely. The board cited a strict morality clause, but Patricia knew the truth. Wealth was the only true shield in their circle, and without it, she was nothing more than a contagious liability. She was a pariah in the very society she had sacrificed her own daughter to climb. Audrey's descent was even steeper and infinitely more humiliating. Federal authorities did not hesitate to dismantle the opulent life Jamal built on stolen funds. Agents seized her downtown penthouse, chaining the doors and changing the locks, while she stood sobbing in the hallway. The luxury cars, including the convertible she demanded just moments before Jamal's arrest, were towed away by federal contractors. Left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a single suitcase of hastily gathered belongings, Audrey was forced to pack up and retreat to the only place left. She moved back into Richard and Patricia's suburban estate, a home that was rapidly deteriorating into a tomb. The atmosphere inside the mansion was suffocating. The electricity had not been disconnected yet, but the house remained cloaked in shadows. Patricia refused to open the heavy silk drapes, terrified that a passing neighbor or a lurking photographer might catch a glimpse of their ruin. The grand living room, once the proud staging ground for their lavish holiday parties, was now cluttered with cheap cardboard moving boxes. They sat surrounded by the remnants of their shattered empire, waiting in the gloom. Despite the overwhelming evidence of their destruction, a sickening layer of delusion clung to the family. They sat around the unlit fireplace, clinging to a fabricated narrative where Natalie was simply waiting for the right moment to swoop in and rescue them. Audrey clutched a lukewarm mug of coffee, her eyes red and swollen, insisting that Natalie was just teaching them a lesson. She reasoned that her sister, who possessed $18 million in liquid capital, could easily stroke a check to the mysterious private holding company that purchased their debt. Richard paced the hardwood floor, heavily relying on his own arrogant logic. He calculated that Natalie would never allow her parents to face the indignity of a public eviction. He convinced himself that she was utilizing her financial acumen to negotiate a better buyout rate for the house behind the scenes. Patricia nodded along with their frantic justifications, her manicured hands trembling in her lap. She completely ignored the harsh reality of her last phone call with her daughter. She chose to believe that Natalie was inherently obligated to maintain the family's image. Patricia spoke into the dark room, declaring they just needed to swallow their pride for a few minutes, offer a polite apology, and allow Natalie to play the hero. They fundamentally believed that wealth was a shared family asset, forgetting they spent her entire life denying her a place at their table. They waited for the front door to open, fully expecting Natalie to walk through with a signed deed and a forgiving smile. They had no comprehension of the absolute devastation heading their way. 2,000 miles away, the wheels of a commercial jet kissed the tarmac at O'Hare International Airport. Natalie bypassed the baggage claim entirely, moving through the bustling terminal with the precise, unhurried stride of a woman who held every single card. The crisp, Swiss air had cleared her mind, but the gritty, familiar energy of Chicago sharpened her focus. She stepped out into the bustling arrivals lane and slid into the back of a waiting car. The driver asked if she wanted to head straight home to her luxurious downtown apartment to rest. Natalie shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on the towering skyline ahead of them. She instructed the driver to bypass her residence completely and head towards the city center. She urgently needed to visit her legal counsel to finalize the last steps of her meticulously planned strategy. The car wove through the heavy afternoon traffic, eventually pulling up to the sleek, glass-fronted building that housed Oliver's private law firm. Natalie stepped out, ignoring the chill in the air, and took the elevator directly to the top floor. Oliver was waiting for her in his conference room, a thick stack of finalized property deeds and bank statements spread across the polished table. He looked up, noting the absolute calm radiating from her posture. Natalie did not sit down. She walked over to the windows, looking down at the sprawling city that had once felt like a cage. She turned back to Oliver, her expression completely devoid of hesitation, malice, or pity. It was simply business. She placed her hands on the table and issued her final instruction. She told him to print the documents, finalize the holding company transfer, and immediately prepare the final eviction notices. The grace period was officially over. The heavy glass doors of Oliver's downtown law firm swung open, admitting the ruined remnants of the once proud family. Richard, Patricia, and Audrey stepped into the sleek, aggressively modern reception area. The visual contrast between the environment and the arrivals was jarring. Oliver's firm exuded quiet, calculated power with its polished concrete floors, minimalist leather furniture, and sweeping panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. The three arrivals, however, looked entirely broken. Richard wore a wrinkled, ill-fitting suit jacket that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame, his face pale and shadowed with dark circles from a grueling week of sleepless terror. Patricia, stripped completely of her usual immaculate country club armor, clutched a worn designer handbag against her chest like a shield. Her hair hung flat and lifeless around her shoulders. Audrey looked the absolute worst of all. Without her luxury penthouse, her imported sports cars, and her limitless platinum credit card, she appeared entirely hollowed out. She shuffled behind her parents, wearing oversized sweatpants and a stained cashmere sweater. They moved with the hesitant energy of cornered animals, expecting a trap, but devoid of alternative options. A paralegal guided them down the sunlit corridor toward the primary conference room. As the frosted glass doors slid apart, the room's temperature seemed to plummet. Natalie sat at the head of the massive mahogany conference table. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored navy designer suit that projected unyielding, terrifying authority. Her posture was flawless, her expression an impenetrable mask of calm. Oliver sat quietly to her right, his hands folded neatly over a legal pad, observing the spectacle with professional detachment. The moment Patricia locked eyes with her youngest daughter, a desperate fabricated switch flipped in her brain. She let out a breathless, trembling gasp, forcing a wide smile onto her exhausted face. She practically lunged forward, her arms extended wide, attempting to close the distance for a dramatic display of maternal affection. She cried out Natalie's name, acting as if they had been separated by a minor misunderstanding. Natalie did not flinch. She did not stand up to greet her. She simply raised her right hand, her palm facing outward, in a universal, non-negotiable command to stop. Patricia hit an invisible wall, freezing dead in her tracks just 3 feet away from the polished edge of the table. The silence that followed was deafening. Natalie instructed her mother to take a seat, sounding like a liquidator addressing a defaulted debtor. Richard pulled out a leather chair and sank into it, signaling for Patricia and Audrey to do the same. He cleared his dry throat, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former patriarchal authority. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and demanded to know the exact details of the plan. He spoke rapidly, his delusions still firmly intact, assuming that Natalie's presence in this high-end law firm meant she was orchestrating a massive financial bailout for the family. He rambled about structuring a discreet bridge loan, proposing ridiculous repayment terms based on assets they no longer possessed. He insisted they needed immediate liquid capital to rescue Audrey's seized bank accounts and secure a federal defense attorney for Jamal. He claimed the family's reputation could still be salvaged if they quietly transferred funds to the angry investors. He begged Natalie to release the $18 million from the blind trust, promising her this temporary setback was just a minor market correction. He spoke with the desperate fervor of a drowning man trying to bargain with the ocean, ignoring the fact his financial empire was built on lies. Audrey slouched deep into her expensive leather chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She glared at Natalie with pure venom. She interrupted her father's frantic financial negotiations, her voice a bitter hiss echoing in the quiet room. She muttered that none of this desperate maneuvering would be necessary if Natalie had not tipped off the federal authorities in the first place. Audrey spat out the accusation entirely, blaming her younger sister for reporting Jamal's multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. She conveniently ignored the undeniable fact that her husband had systematically stolen the life savings of dozens of innocent people, including the total liquidation of their own parents' retirement accounts. Audrey whined that Natalie had ruined her perfect life out of petty jealousy, claiming federal agents had humiliated her by dragging her out of her penthouse. She refused to accept any accountability for the luxury lifestyle she had enjoyed, funded entirely by fraudulent wire transfers. She sat in the conference room demanding an apology from the only person who tried to warn them. Natalie let Audrey's toxic accusation hang in the air, refusing to engage with the level of delusion. She looked at the three ruined people sitting across from her, registering their exhaustion, their desperation, and their complete inability to grasp the reality of their situation. They still believed they were entitled to her wealth. They still believed they were the innocent victims of a misunderstanding rather than the architects of their own destruction. Natalie turned her attention back to Richard, silencing his rambling with a single sharp look. She reached out and placed her hand on a black leather folder resting on the table in front of her. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she slid the folder across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop directly in front of Richard's trembling hands. She leaned back in her chair and instructed him to open it. Richard stared at the black cover as if it were a loaded weapon. He slowly reached out, unfastened the metal clasp, and flipped the folder open. Inside lay a stack of freshly stamped, notarized legal documents. The bold print at the top of the first page caught his eye immediately. It was the official property deed for their sprawling suburban mansion, the estate that was supposed to be entering foreclosure that very morning. The cold realization finally shattered his delusion, leaving him gasping for air. Richard's eyes darted across the heavy watermarked paper. He expected to see the logo of some faceless, predatory banking conglomerate, the type of institution that routinely carved up distressed assets and sold them for parts. Instead, the bold embossed lettering at the top of the deed identified the new lien holder as Apex Summit Holdings, LLC. His brow furrowed in confusion. He had never heard of the firm. His trembling index finger traced the lines of dense legal text, moving down past the property description, past the outstanding loan balance, until it rested squarely on the signature block. There, printed in crisp, undeniable black ink, was the name of the sole proprietor and managing director of the holding company, Natalie Adams. The blood instantly drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The heavy parchment slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering onto the polished mahogany table like a dead leaf. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound emerged from his throat. He looked up, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto his youngest daughter. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a predator who had just seamlessly outmaneuvered him in a game he did not even realize they were playing. Patricia, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the room's atmosphere, snatched the fallen document from the table. She squinted at the fine print, her lips moving silently as she read the names. A sharp gasp tore from her lungs. The fake maternal warmth she had attempted to project just moments earlier vanished, completely replaced by raw, unadulterated shock. Audrey leaned over her mother's shoulder, her eyes scanning the deed. Her permanent scowl morphed into a slack-jawed expression of absolute disbelief. Natalie sat perfectly still, silently observing their synchronized realization with absolute chilling detachment. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply folded her two perfectly manicured hands neatly in front of her. She explained the timeline to them, speaking with the cold, measured precision of a corporate liquidator. She detailed how exactly 6 months prior she had first noticed the glaring irregularities in Jamal's financial filings. She described tracking the offshore routing numbers, the heavily leveraged properties, and the massive, frantic withdrawals from Richard's private wealth management accounts. While Richard had been busy blindly signing bridge loans and ignoring margin calls, Natalie had been diligently mapping the inevitable collapse of Jamal's fraudulent empire. She knew the federal raid was coming. She knew the bank would aggressively attempt to offload the toxic debt tied to the Beacon Hill estate. So she formed Apex Summit Holdings. She utilized a fraction of her secure $18 million trust to quietly purchase the primary mortgage on their mansion for pennies on the dollar. She legally acquired their debt long before the FBI ever kicked down Jamal's office doors. She did not just protect her own assets from their desperate illegal power of attorney scheme. She had systematically purchased the very ground they walked on. Richard clutched the edge of the conference table, his knuckles turning white. He stammered, his voice weak and brittle, demanding to know how she could do something so cold and calculating to her own flesh and blood. He accused her of orchestrating their ruin, of laying a trap for them when they were at their most vulnerable. He begged her to tear up the documents, to forgive the debt, to act like a loyal daughter, and save the family legacy. Natalie leaned slightly forward, resting her forearms on the smooth surface of the table. The ambient temperature in the quiet room seemed to physically drop another 10 freezing degrees. She turned her gaze directly to Patricia. She asked her mother if she remembered a specific Tuesday afternoon from 14 years ago. Patricia blinked, utterly confused by the sudden shift in topic, shaking her head defensively. Natalie did not let her look away. She painted the memory for them in vivid, agonizing detail. She reminded Patricia of the day she had marched into her teenage daughter's bedroom, handed her 2 cheap cardboard boxes, and instructed her to pack her belongings immediately. Natalie recounted how she had been abruptly exiled to the damp, unfinished basement, forced to sleep on a sagging cot next to the humming water heater. Patricia had justified the cruel eviction by claiming the family simply needed more space. But Natalie reminded her mother of the real humiliating reason. Audrey had complained that her wardrobe was expanding, and she absolutely required a secondary walk-in closet for her designer shoes and seasonal coats. Patricia and Richard had unhesitatingly prioritized Audrey's luxury accessories over their youngest daughter's basic need for a bedroom. They had literally discarded her to make room for Audrey's shoes. Audrey shifted uncomfortably in her chair, staring down at her stained sweatpants, suddenly unable to meet her sister's eyes. Patricia opened her mouth, a desperate defensive excuse dying on her lips before she could vocalize it. The undeniable, brutal truth of their past cruelty hung heavily in the air, completely suffocating their current pleas for familial mercy. Natalie looked at the 3 ruined individuals sitting across from her. They had spent her entire life treating her as a disposable asset, a convenient scapegoat, and a secondary citizen in her own home. They had mocked her boundaries, belittled her achievements, and ultimately tried to steal her future to fund a criminal lifestyle. Now the power dynamic was permanently, irreversibly inverted. Natalie tapped her manicured index finger against the black folder. She looked her parents dead in the eye, her expression an impenetrable mask of absolute authority. She informed them that the deed transfer was complete and legally binding. She stated with crystal clarity that she was no longer their scapegoat, their backup plan, or their obedient child. She told them that she was their landlord now. She leaned closer, ensuring they understood their grim reality. She stated very softly that she absolutely never accepts late payments. Patricia's pristine facade, cultivated over decades of exclusive country club luncheons and elite galas, shattered completely. The breath hitched in her throat, trapped in a sudden, violent spasm of panic. She began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she clawed at the collar of her silk blouse. The polished mahogany table offered no physical comfort as she slumped heavily against it, her manicured nails scratching uselessly against the hard, unforgiving surface. Richard remained paralyzed, his wide eyes locked on the legal document that effectively stripped him of his final shred of dignity, authority, and wealth. He opened his mouth, but the oxygen seemed to have been sucked entirely from the sprawling conference room. The sickening realization that their youngest daughter held their absolute ruin in her hands temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords. The power dynamic had shifted so violently and absolutely that it left the older couple physically incapacitated. Audrey, however, possessed a different mechanism for handling catastrophic failure. Her initial shock rapidly ignited into feral, unhinged rage. She vaulted out of her leather chair, the heavy piece of furniture tipping backward and crashing loudly against the panoramic glass window. She slammed her fists onto the table, her face contorted in an ugly mask of pure entitlement. She screamed that this entire setup was completely illegal. Saliva flew from her trembling lips as she shrieked that a daughter could not simply foreclose on her own parents. She aggressively threatened to call the police to drag Natalie into a criminal court and to sue the law firm for facilitating what she called a fraudulent family coup. Audrey demanded that Oliver immediately shred the documents loudly, claiming that Jamal's legal team would dismantle this holding company scheme within the hour. Her voice reached a shrill, piercing pitch, bouncing off the sleek concrete walls, broadcasting her absolute ignorance of financial law and her profound denial of their new reality. She genuinely believed that throwing a tantrum could reverse a legally binding property transfer. Oliver did not flinch at the dramatic outburst. He calmly reached forward, adjusting his metal glasses before lacing his fingers together over his legal pad. His voice sliced through Audrey's hysterical screaming with the surgical precision of a seasoned attorney who had systematically dismantled thousands of arrogant debtors. He politely requested that she lower her voice, reminding her that this was a place of professional business, not a daytime reality television set. He then turned his attention directly to Richard, deciding to address the only person in the room who might possess a rudimentary understanding of the dire situation. Oliver meticulously dismantled their remaining fragile defenses. He explained that the foreclosure was entirely unequivocally legal. He outlined exactly how Richard had recklessly leveraged the family estate to secure an illicit bridge loan for Jamal's crumbling investment firm. He methodically noted the multiple missed payment deadlines, the willfully ignored delinquency notices, and the subsequent default status of the entire property. The original bank had eagerly auctioned off the toxic debt to mitigate their own exposure to Jamal's federal indictment. Apex Summit Holdings simply purchased the defaulted mortgage on the open market. The new owner, Oliver, concluded with a slight deferential nod toward Natalie, possessed the absolute legal right to exercise the acceleration clause and immediately clear the property of its current defaulting occupants. The clinical delivery of the undisputed facts extinguished the last dying embers of Audrey's rage, leaving her trembling, defeated, and entirely speechless. Patricia, however, interpreted the legal finality as a direct signal to employ her ultimate desperate emotional weapon. She abandoned all aristocratic pride, sliding out of her chair and collapsing heavily onto the polished concrete floor. She crawled the short, humiliating distance to Natalie's chair, the fabric of her expensive trousers whispering against the stone. She dropped heavily to her knees, looking up at the daughter she had systematically ignored and belittled for nearly 3 decades. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her flawless makeup and exposing the raw, pathetic terror beneath the surface. Patricia grabbed the bottom hem of Natalie's navy suit jacket, her hands shaking violently. She began to beg. She promised that everything would change immediately. She swore they would finally treat Natalie like the cherished golden child, permanently elevating her above Audrey and Jamal. She vowed to publicly respect her incredible business acumen, to openly celebrate her immense wealth, and to finally be the real, loving family Natalie had always secretly craved. She offered to rewrite their entire shared history, desperately pleading for a second chance to play the role of a devoted, supportive mother. She bargained with fake affection, attempting to purchase her housing security with counterfeit maternal love. Natalie looked down at the weeping woman, desperately clutching her jacket. She felt absolutely nothing inside her. There was no fiery vindication, no soft pity, and no lingering bitter resentment. The complete emotional void was the ultimate confirmation of her absolute freedom from their toxic control. She calmly reached down and methodically peeled Patricia's trembling fingers off her pristine suit, letting her mother's hands drop heavily back onto the cold floor. Natalie stood up, her posture radiating absolute, untouchable dominance. She casually adjusted her jacket, looking down at the utterly broken family, staring up at her with terrified eyes. She stated in a voice completely devoid of any human emotion that genuine respect cannot be miraculously bought with real estate, and it is now far too late for them to finally audition for the role of a real family. She picked up her heavy leather briefcase, her movements calculated, deliberate, and unhurried. She looked directly at her defeated father, then at a silent Audrey, and finally at her mother sobbing helplessly on the concrete. She issued her final legal decree, cutting through their pathetic weeping with absolute terrifying finality that echoed loudly throughout the sterile room. She informed them that they had exactly 30 days to pack all their personal belongings and permanently vacate the premises before facing immediate law enforcement eviction procedures. The ticking clock of the 30-day eviction notice sounded the definitive death knell for the family's manufactured reality. Federal prosecutors offered no leniency to the architect of their downfall. Jamal, stripped of his expensive defense team and facing an insurmountable mountain of irrefutable forensic accounting, officially surrendered. He stood in the sterile federal courthouse wearing a standard-issue prison jumpsuit and publicly pled guilty to systematically defrauding dozens of vulnerable investors. The presiding judge delivered a swift, brutal sentence of 7 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Audrey did not even bother to attend the morning sentencing hearing. She was entirely consumed by the immediate crushing logistics of her own impending homelessness and the loss of her former high society friends. The final week inside the sprawling suburban mansion was a masterclass in profound humiliation. Richard, a man who had spent the last 2 decades hiring boutique moving companies to seamlessly handle his luxury acquisitions, was reduced to driving a rented, dented yellow box truck. He struggled helplessly to operate the heavy rear ramp, his once impeccable tailored trousers ruined by grease and driveway dirt. Patricia spent her final hours frantically wrapping her remaining discounted crystal in old newspaper, her manicured hands blistered and raw from the unaccustomed manual labor. They were forced to abandon the heavy custom-made mahogany furniture that had previously defined their aristocratic illusion. The colossal ornate items simply would not physically fit into their grim, severely downgraded new reality. That reality was a cramped, poorly ventilated 2-bedroom apartment situated in a neglected low-income suburb bordering the city's industrial district. The dilapidated brick building smelled faintly of stale cooking oil and damp carpet. Richard and Patricia claimed the primary bedroom, leaving Audrey to drag her hastily packed suitcases into a tiny, drafty secondary room overlooking a cracked asphalt parking lot. The suffocating physical constriction of the small space perfectly mirrored their absolute, irreversible financial ruin. They were constantly living on top of one another, the thin, poorly insulated walls offering zero protection from their bitter, endless arguments about who was ultimately to blame for their spectacular downfall. Audrey's steep descent hit absolute rock bottom when the final remnants of her seized bank accounts completely dried up. Confronted by the very real threat of starvation and eviction from their new, squalid quarters, she was forced to swallow the last bitter pill of her destroyed ego. She applied for and secured a minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing outlet located 2 miles from their apartment. The arrogant woman who once spent Tuesday afternoons sipping imported champagne while purchasing entire seasonal designer collections now spent her exhausting days aggressively folding clearance sweaters and enduring the rude demands of impatient bargain-hunting shoppers. Her feet ached constantly, her toxic spirit was utterly broken, and she had absolutely no one left to manipulate for a quick financial bailout. On the 30th day, exactly at the stroke of noon, a sleek black town car pulled to a silent stop at the edge of the sprawling estate's manicured driveway. Natalie sat perfectly still in the back seat, the dark-tinted windows shielding her from the harsh afternoon sun. She watched with cold, clinical detachment as Richard violently yanked the rolling rear door of the rented moving truck shut. He secured the heavy metal padlock, his aging shoulders slumped in a posture of absolute crushing defeat. He climbed heavily into the driver's seat next to Patricia, who sat rigid, staring blankly straight ahead at the road. The heavy truck groaned loudly as it pulled away from the curb, carrying the shattered remnants of the family away from the property forever. Inside the luxurious town car, Natalie's phone illuminated on the premium leather seat beside her. The digital caller ID brightly displayed Patricia's name. It was a final desperate attempt to bridge the unbridgeable chasm, a pathetic weeping grasp at a maternal relationship that had been dead for over 2 decades. Natalie did not answer the call. She did not hesitate or feel a single twinge of guilt. She picked up the device, tapped the glowing screen, and blocked the phone number permanently. She systematically blocked Richard and Audrey as well, digitally severing the final fraying thread that tethered her to their lifelong toxicity. Natalie stepped out of the air-conditioned car and walked briskly up the long, sweeping stone pathway toward the front door. She unlocked the heavy oak double doors and pushed them wide open. She stepped inside the grand foyer and paused. The silence surrounding her was profound and absolute. It was not the oppressive, heavy silence of her childhood where she constantly had to tiptoe across the floorboards to avoid triggering Patricia's unpredictable wrath or Richard's dismissive cutting lectures. This was a clean, pure, and entirely liberated silence. The toxic echoes of her upbringing, the relentless constant comparisons to Audrey, the cruel remarks about her independent choices, and the relentless emotional starvation had all been entirely scrubbed from the atmosphere. The massive house was now just a hollow, meaningless shell of drywall, glass, and timber. She walked slowly through the empty living room, her steady footsteps echoing sharply off the bare, polished hardwood floors. She felt absolutely no lingering nostalgia, no hidden affection for the physical structure that had housed so much quiet pain. She turned and walked back out the front door, leaving it standing wide open to the elements. A commercial pickup truck pulled into the driveway, parking behind her town car. A burly man wearing a neon safety vest and a hard hat stepped out of the vehicle holding a metal clipboard. Natalie walked down the steps, her expression serene, and handed him the brass ring holding the property keys. She looked at the sprawling mansion one last time, turned back to the waiting commercial demolition contractor, and calmly gave him the final, irreversible authorization to tear the entire structure down to the foundational dirt, erasing the nightmare forever. 6 months later, the bitter winter winds of Chicago had given way to the heavy, humid heat of early summer. Natalie stood at the edge of a massive, flattened expanse of dirt and gravel, wearing a pristine white trench coat. The sprawling suburban mansion that once stood on this plot of land was completely gone. Not a single brick shard of glass or splinter of mahogany trim remained behind today. The commercial demolition contractor she hired had been flawlessly efficient, completing the extensive physical teardown exactly on her strict schedule. They had stripped the property down to its fundamental core, eradicating the physical structure along with every toxic childhood memory. In its place, a fleet of heavy industrial steamrollers and paving machines rumbled loudly, laying down thick tracks of asphalt. Natalie had rezoned the prime real estate, transforming the former symbol of her parents' fabricated aristocratic status into something functional. She was actively converting the sprawling residential footprint into a highly lucrative, massively scaled commercial parking facility for urban commuters. The location was perfectly situated near a rapidly expanding commercial transit hub, guaranteeing a consistent stream of daily passive income. She watched the municipal workers paint crisp, bright yellow parking lines onto the fresh asphalt, feeling a profound, absolute peace. There was no lingering guilt gnawing at her conscience, no residual sadness clouding her crystal-clear vision of the future. The deeply dysfunctional family dynamic had been permanently, irreversibly severed without a single ounce of hesitation or subsequent emotional regret. Richard, Patricia, and Audrey were completely blocked from every aspect of her existence, essentially erased from her daily operating reality. She did not know their current phone numbers. She did not know the specific address of their cramped suburban apartment. She fundamentally did not care where they ended up after loading their belongings into that moving truck. The emotional void where her desperate childhood yearning used to exist was now permanently filled with cold, impenetrable, solid concrete. The complete destruction of Jamal's fraudulent empire had left a massive crater in the Chicago financial district months ago today. However, the chaotic dust generated by the federal indictments and subsequent corporate collapse was finally beginning to settle down completely. Earlier that morning, Natalie had listened to a local public radio broadcast while driving her luxury car through downtown traffic. The lead anchor reported a surprising, overwhelmingly positive update on the high-profile federal fraud case that dominated daily headlines. The vulnerable victims of Jamal's ruthless Ponzi scheme were finally receiving their first round of heavily anticipated partial financial restitution. The retired public school teachers, the local small business owners, and the unsuspecting amateur investors were slowly getting their money. The swift recovery of these stolen funds was unprecedented in legal cases involving such massive corporate theft. The seasoned news anchor attributed this miraculous recovery directly to an incredibly detailed anonymous whistleblower dossier provided to federal prosecutors. This comprehensive package had been hand-delivered to the authorities on the exact same day the FBI raided downtown offices. The dossier contained exact offshore routing numbers, hidden shell company registries, and a clear roadmap of every single stolen dollar. Natalie smiled faintly, clearly remembering the late nights she spent meticulously compiling that exact encrypted drive in her secure penthouse. She had not simply walked away from the financial wreckage her greedy family had carelessly left behind. She had systematically ensured that the innocent people Audrey and Jamal slaughtered financially would get their livelihoods back. It was the ultimate silent victory, proving her moral superiority over the corrupt individuals who once claimed to love her. She had utilized the exact same financial brilliance her parents had relentlessly mocked to actively dismantle their massive criminal enterprise. Natalie turned away from the active construction site, stepping confidently back into the sleek interior of her waiting town car. She politely directed her professional driver to take her back to the bustling city center for her next scheduled appointment. 30 minutes later, she walked into an exclusive high-end coffee shop located on the ground floor of a skyscraper. The friendly barista greeted her warmly by name, immediately handing over her perfectly prepared black espresso in a plain cup. Natalie took a comfortable seat at a quiet corner table overlooking the busy downtown street, opening her ultra-thin laptop. Her own elite forensic accounting firm, Apex Financial Defense, was currently experiencing a period of explosive, entirely unprecedented national growth. The highly publicized collapse of Jamal's firm had sent massive shockwaves through the corporate sector, triggering widespread panic among investors. This panic created a desperate, nationwide corporate demand for uncompromising financial audits to prevent similar catastrophic losses in other firms. Natalie's firm had rapidly gained national recognition for its ruthless efficiency in corporate fraud prevention and deep forensic auditing services. Major Fortune 500 corporations, private equity firms, and powerful banking institutions were constantly bidding for her exclusive services today. She was no longer just a successful, independent contractor, working quietly in the background to identify risky, volatile corporate investments. She had successfully built a formidable multi-million-dollar corporate empire entirely from scratch, utilizing her raw intelligence and unyielding grit. Her professional schedule was booked solid for the next 2 years, ensuring exceptional revenue growth and unmatched industry security forward. She took a slow sip of her espresso, turning her gaze away from the glowing laptop screen. She looked out through the massive glass windows at the magnificent Chicago skyline, stretching beautifully in the warm afternoon sun. The city was a towering monument of steel glass and limitless ambition, perfectly reflecting her own boundless professional trajectory today. It no longer represented a cage of familial expectations, nor a toxic battleground for seeking basic validation. It was simply her kingdom conquered, using her sharp mind and relentless personal discipline. She reflected deeply, realizing that family is not defined by blood, but by genuine respect. She built her empire through brilliance, outsmarted those trying to destroy her, and secured an entirely permanently untouchable future.
you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.